My wife spent 20 years restoring a classic boat. When I found the garage empty, my own son stood in the driveway and told me he sold it because his wife demanded a luxury trip to Paris. He looked me in the eye and said, "Mom is gone, Dad. Get over it." I was completely devastated until my phone rang a few hours later. The man on the other end said, "Mr. Ford, your wife left something sealed inside the hull of the boat I just bought from your son. I tried to remove it, but you need to come down here right now." When I arrived and saw what she had hidden, my entire world froze. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family member who completely underestimated you. My name is Howard Ford. I am 70 years old, and for the entirety of my adult life, I believed that a family built on a foundation of hard work and honest love was impenetrable. I believed that the sacrifices you make for your children are deposited into a vault of mutual respect. I was wrong. The reality of my failure as a judge of character did not hit me in a boardroom or during a heated argument. It hit me on a quiet Tuesday morning, standing in the center of my own garage. I had just returned from picking up supplies at the local hardware store, a mundane errand that gave rhythm to my retirement. I pressed the button on the wall to open the garage door, expecting to be greeted by the familiar comforting silhouette of a 1968 Chris Craft wooden boat. Instead, the heavy door rolled upward to reveal a cavernous, echoing void. The boat was gone. There was only a large, rectangular stain of old oil on the concrete, and the lingering, ghostly scent of varnished mahogany and marine paint. I stood there holding a paper bag of brass fittings, feeling the air completely leave my lungs. For 20 years, that boat had occupied that exact spot. It was not just a vessel. It was a monument to patience, a labor of love that defined the last chapters of my marriage. And now the space was violently empty. The heavy wooden trailer blocks had been kicked aside. The custom canvas cover my wife had sewn with her own hands lay crumpled in the corner like discarded trash. I dropped the bag. The brass fittings hit the concrete with a sharp, echoing clatter that snapped me out of my paralysis. I did not panic. I did not call the police to report a theft, because in the pit of my stomach, a dark and terrible intuition was already taking shape. I walked out of the garage, the morning sun suddenly feeling cold against my skin. I marched down the driveway toward the street, my eyes scanning the neighborhood. That is when I saw him, my son Connor. He was standing near the curb, leaning casually against the open door of his overpriced luxury sedan. He was 35 years old, dressed in a crisp designer shirt that cost more than my first car, wiping a smudge of trailer grease from his soft, uncalloused hands with a shop rag. There was no greeting. There was no hesitation. I walked straight up to him, stopping just inches from his face. "Where is it?" I asked. My voice was dangerously low, stripped of any paternal warmth. Connor did not flinch. He tossed the dirty rag onto the passenger seat of his car and let out a long, theatrical sigh, the kind of sigh a parent gives a petulant child. He looked at me with an expression of supreme boredom, his eyes reflecting a chilling emptiness that I had refused to acknowledge for years. "I sold it," he said as casually as if he were talking about an old lawnmower. "I sold it to a private dealer down by the marina this morning. They came and hitched it up while you were at the store." The sheer audacity of his confession felt like a physical blow to my chest. "You sold your mother's boat?" I stated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. "Why?" Connor crossed his arms and leaned back against his expensive car. "Monica wanted to go to Paris for our anniversary," he replied, rolling his eyes, as if my lack of understanding was a burden to him. "We needed the cash, Dad. That pile of wood was just taking up space in the garage collecting dust. It is practically a relic. The dealer offered a premium price for the vintage hull, and I took it. Monica deserves a luxury trip, and that boat was doing nothing but rotting away." I stared at the man standing before me, desperately searching his face for any trace of the boy I had raised. I looked for a flicker of guilt, a shadow of remorse, but there was absolutely nothing. There was only the arrogant entitlement of a parasite who had grown fat on the sacrifices of others. "You had no right," I whispered, my voice trembling, not with fear, but with a rage so profound it terrified me. "That boat was not yours to sell. It belonged to her." Connor scoffed, a cruel, dismissive sound that echoed in the quiet suburban street. "Mom is gone, Dad." He said, his words dripping with a venomous condescension. "She is gone, and Monica wanted Paris. Get over it. You cannot just hold on to dead things forever. It is time to move on and let the living actually enjoy the money." He turned his back on me, sliding into the leather driver's seat of his car. He did not look back as he started the engine. He simply pulled the door shut, leaving me standing in a cloud of exhaust fumes. He expected me to scream. He expected me to bang on his window, to threaten him, to cause a public scene that he could later use to paint me as an unstable, irrational old man. But I did not give him that satisfaction. I embraced a terrifying, absolute silence. I watched his taillights disappear around the corner, taking with him the last shred of illusion I held about our family. I walked back up the driveway, my legs moving mechanically. I stepped back into the hollow garage, the empty space amplifying the heavy beating of my own heart. I walked over to the oil stain on the concrete and stood exactly where the helm of the Chris Craft used to be. The silence of the room was oppressive, pressing down on my shoulders with the weight of 1,000 memories. I closed my eyes, and the empty space immediately filled with the ghost of my wife Diane. The audience of my life knew Diane as a quiet, graceful woman, but in this garage she was a relentless force of nature. I remembered the long, grueling years of her illness. I remembered the brutal chemotherapy sessions that stripped her of her strength and her hair, leaving her fragile and exhausted. But she refused to surrender. When the doctors told her she had to rest, she would wrap a bandana around her head, walk out to this garage, and pick up a sanding block. That boat was her defiance. It was her rebellion against the dying of the light. I remembered the sight of her small, trembling hands meticulously restoring the mahogany planks. I remembered wiping sawdust from her pale cheeks as she coughed, refusing to go back inside until the varnish was perfectly smooth. She spent her final pain-free hours sitting right here, running her fingers over the polished wood, telling me that as long as this boat survived, a part of her spirit would always be anchored to this world. Connor knew all of this. He was old enough to watch his mother bleed her final ounces of vitality into that hull. He watched her labor over it when she could barely stand. Yet he looked at that sacred monument and saw nothing but airline tickets to Paris and a way to appease his greedy wife. He had traded his mother's ghost for a week of luxury hotels and expensive champagne. The depth of the violation was incomprehensible. It was a desecration of the highest order. He had not just stolen a piece of property, he had auctioned off the physical embodiment of Diane's courage. The air in the garage suddenly felt suffocating. I reached out and picked up the discarded canvas cover, burying my face in the heavy fabric. It still smelled faintly of her favorite hand cream and marine wax. I stood alone in the ruins of my sanctuary, allowing the gravity of my son's betrayal to fully crystallize in my mind. I was no longer a father. I was a man who had just been robbed by a ruthless adversary. The silence of the garage was suddenly and violently shattered by a sharp electronic ring. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The caller ID flashed a name I recognized from local advertisements. Gavin Reed. He was the owner of a high-end vintage boat dealership down near the commercial marina. I pressed the answer button and brought the phone to my ear. Before I could even speak, a voice rushed through the speaker, breathless and strained with panic. "Mr. Ford," the voice stammered. "This is Gavin Reed down at the marina. We need to talk." I tightened my grip on the phone. "Do you have my boat?" "Gavin?" I asked, my voice cutting through the air like a razor. Yes, sir, I do, he replied quickly, his words stumbling over one another. Your son Connor brought it in this morning. He had the keys and a signed bill of sale. I swear to you, Mr. Ford, I thought everything was completely legitimate. I would never have touched the vessel if I had known there was a family dispute. I did not care about Gavin's excuses. I only cared about retrieving the last piece of my wife. I am coming down there right now to collect my property. I told him, turning to head back inside the house to grab my truck keys. You had better not have touched a single plank of that mahogany. Please, sir, listen to me, Gavin interrupted, his voice shaking with a genuine, undeniable terror. This is not just about the sale. I was doing a standard intake inspection on the hull. I was checking the wiring behind the steering console. Mr. Ford, your wife left something inside the boat. I stopped dead in my tracks. The blood in my veins turned to ice. What are you talking about? I demanded. Gavin took a ragged breath over the line. There is a hidden compartment sealed behind the helm, he whispered. I tried to remove the panel to inspect the gauges, but it is locked tight with a heavy steel mechanism. Mr. Ford, there are documents shoved in the crack of the panel. I pulled one out. It has your name on it, and it has a seal from a federal bank. You need to come down here right now. Do not tell your son. Just get here. The line went dead. I lowered the phone, staring at the blank screen as the implications of Gavin's words crashed over me. Diane had built a hidden compartment. Diane had left documents sealed inside the hull. My grief instantly evaporated, replaced by a surging electrical current of adrenaline. My wife had known something. She had anticipated a breach. I turned around, locked the empty garage, and practically ran into the house to grab my keys. The time for mourning was officially over. I was going to retrieve what belonged to me, and I was going to find out exactly what my wife had taken to her grave. The drive to the commercial marina took exactly 22 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I did not roll down the windows to let in the coastal breeze. I drove in absolute silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. The road blurred past me, but my mind was entirely consumed by the echoing finality of my son's voice. Mom is gone, Dad, get over it. He had said it with the casual arrogance of a man swatting away a fly. I parked my truck outside a massive corrugated metal warehouse near the industrial docks. The smell of raw diesel and stagnant salt water hung heavy in the air. Standing by the rolling steel door was Gavin Reed. He was a man in his late 40s wearing a polo shirt with his dealership logo embroidered on the chest. He looked pale, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, like a man waiting for a firing squad. As soon as I cut the engine and stepped out of the truck, Gavin started talking, his words rushing out in a desperate, panicked stream. Mr. Ford, I am so incredibly sorry. You have to believe me, I had no idea there was any kind of family dispute going on. Connor told me you were downsizing, that you just wanted the boat gone. He had the keys. He had the title paperwork all signed and ready to go. I would never intentionally involve my business in stolen property. I slammed the truck door shut. The loud metallic crack echoed off the warehouse walls, silencing him instantly. I did not walk toward him to offer comfort. I did not care about his business reputation or his panic. I stopped 3 feet away from him and looked him dead in the eye. My voice came out completely hollow, stripped of any warmth or forgiveness. Where is my wife's boat, Gavin? He swallowed hard, his chest heaving nervously. He gestured toward the open warehouse door and took a step back to let me pass. Right this way, sir. I have not let anyone else near it. I walked past him into the cavernous building. Harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile, clinical glare over rows of modern fiberglass speedboats and pontoon cruisers. And there, sitting on a heavy-duty steel trailer in the center of the concrete floor, was Diane's 1968 Chris Craft. Seeing it trapped in this cold commercial graveyard felt like walking into a morgue and finding a loved one laid out on an examination table. The rich, deep mahogany hull, which Diane had spent 2 decades meticulously sanding and staining by hand, looked completely out of place under the artificial lights. I walked slowly up to the side of the vessel. I raised my hand and let my fingertips glide along the perfectly smooth wood. I could almost feel the phantom warmth of my wife's hands lingering on the surface. I remembered the exact day she finished applying the final coat of varnish. Her breathing had been shallow, her body ravaged by the illness that would soon take her, but she had smiled with a fierce, unconquerable pride. This boat was her legacy, and my son had traded it away for a pair of plane tickets to Paris without a second thought. Gavin approached from behind, keeping a cautious distance as if he were approaching a volatile explosive. "Mr. Ford," he said softly, "I need to show you what I found. When I bring in a vintage vessel, I always do a thorough sweep of the electrical systems behind the dashboard. I climbed aboard to check the wiring harness behind the steering console. That is when I noticed the seam." I turned to look at him, my grief instantly hardening into sharp, focused tension. "What seam?" He gestured toward the aluminum boarding ladder. "Please come aboard. I need you to see this for yourself." I climbed the ladder and stepped over the side, my shoes making a hollow thud against the pristine wooden deck. Gavin led me to the helm. The dashboard of the Chris Craft was a beautiful expanse of polished wood, fitted with original chrome dials and a vintage steering wheel. It looked exactly as it always had. I had sat in the passenger seat dozens of times while Diane worked on this very console. "Look right here beneath the ignition switch." Gavin pointed, a slight tremble returning to his hand. He traced his finger along a line in the wood grain that was virtually invisible to the naked eye. The grain matches perfectly, but the panel is cut. It is a false front. I only noticed it because I dropped my flashlight, and the beam caught the edge of a recessed steel hinge hidden underneath the lip of the console. I knelt down, squinting in the harsh light. I ran my thumb along the underside of the dashboard. Gavin was right. There was a microscopic gap expertly concealed by the natural curve of the wood. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Diane had built a hidden compartment into the helm. She had crafted it with such precision that neither I nor anyone else had ever noticed it. The realization crashed over me, bringing with it a flood of memories from her final months. During the last year of her life, when the doctors had told her to remain in bed, Diane had insisted on dragging herself out to the garage. She told me she was just tinkering with the steering column, making sure the vintage gauges were properly calibrated. I had assumed it was just a dying woman clinging to her passion project to keep her mind off the pain. I had been completely blind. She was not tinkering with gauges. She was building a vault. "Why did you try to open it?" I asked, not taking my eyes off the hidden seam. "I did not know it was a locked compartment." At first, Gavin explained nervously. "I thought it was just an access panel for the fuse box." I applied a little pressure to the wood, and the panel popped loose on a spring hinge. But behind the wood, there is a solid steel box welded directly into the hull framing. I shined my light inside a small gap at the top. I saw documents shoved in there. I managed to pull one piece of paper out with a pair of needle nose pliers before the spring mechanism snapped shut and locked. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of heavy stock paper. It was marked with a federal bank seal. "When I saw your name on this," Gavin whispered, and realized the date on the document was from 3 months before your wife passed away. I knew I had stumbled into something that went way beyond a simple boat sale. Your son sold me this vessel claiming he had full legal right to do so, but this paper suggests otherwise. I took the document from his trembling hand. It was a partial trust declaration. Diane had not just hidden paperwork. She had anticipated a direct attack on our assets. The terrifying truth began to form in my mind with crystal clarity. Diane knew she was dying, and she knew exactly what Connor would do the second she was gone. She knew his greed was insatiable. She knew about Monica's relentless demands for luxury. My wife had spent her final agonizing days physically barricading the truth inside the one thing she knew Connor would eventually try to liquidate for fast cash. She did not hide this to keep a secret from me. She hid it because she knew Connor would come for the money, and she wanted to ensure that when he finally crossed the line, he would unwittingly hand me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him. The agonizing grief of losing her was abruptly swallowed by a cold, terrifying clarity. My son had not just broken my heart. He had walked blindly into a trap meticulously laid by a dying mother who knew her child was a monster. I stared at the locked steel compartment hidden behind the beautiful mahogany. The smoldering conflict was over. The war had just begun. I pressed my thumb against the edge of the wood, feeling for the hidden spring mechanism. The wood was stiff and resistant. It required exactly the right amount of pressure in a specific unnatural direction to bypass the catch. I pushed upward and then forcefully to the right. A sharp metallic click echoed through the silent cavern of the warehouse. The false front of the dashboard popped open, revealing a dark, recessed cavity welded directly into the structural fiberglass of the hull. I reached inside the cold space. My fingers brushed against heavy steel. It was not just a loose stack of papers as Gavin had initially thought. I wrapped my hand around a thick metal handle and pulled. The object was wedged tightly into the cavity to prevent it from rattling during rough waters. I braced my boots against the floorboard of the boat and yanked with all the strength my 70-year-old shoulders could muster. A military-grade waterproof lockbox slid out of the shadows and landed with a heavy thud on the captain's seat. It was painted dark green, scratched along the edges and secured by a solid brass padlock. This was not a hasty hiding spot. This was a fortress. Diane had deliberately chosen a box designed to survive a shipwreck, ensuring that whatever she had buried inside would outlast her by decades. I stared at the brass padlock. I did not have the key. Diane had never given me a key. That realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. She had not given me the key because she knew that if I possessed it, Connor might manipulate or force it out of me before the time was right. She had made sure that the only way to access this box was through brute force, leaving undeniable evidence of the breach. "Get me a crowbar," I said. My voice dropped like the stone. I did not turn to look at Gavin. I kept my eyes entirely fixed on the dark green steel box resting on the vintage leather seat. "Mr. Ford, I do not think we should damage the property." Gavin stammered from the deck, his voice wavering with professional hesitation. "If there is a legal dispute over the vessel, we should probably call the authorities and let them handle whatever is inside that box." I turned my head slowly and looked down at the dealer. He was terrified. He was a man who brokered luxury toys for wealthy clients, completely unequipped to handle the raw, ugly reality of a family tearing itself apart in his showroom. "I am not asking for your legal advice, Gavin," I replied, my tone flat and entirely devoid of negotiation. "My son forged my wife's signature or bypassed my legal authority to sell you a boat he never owned. If you want to involve the police right now, we can certainly have a long conversation with them about your intake procedures and why you handed a large sum of cash to a man without verifying the primary title. Or you can hand me a crowbar and we can figure out exactly what kind of fraud has been committed here before the federal authorities get involved." Gavin swallowed hard. The blood drained completely from his face. He did not say another word. He turned on his heel, practically jogging toward a large red tool chest at the far end of the warehouse. He returned seconds later, holding a heavy 3-foot wrought iron crowbar. He climbed halfway up the boarding ladder and handed it to me with trembling fingers. I took the heavy iron bar. The cold metal grounded me. I turned back to the lockbox. I positioned the hooked edge of the crowbar directly under the loop of the solid brass padlock. I did not pause to consider the implications. I did not stop to wonder if I was ready for the truth. I drove my weight down on the steel bar. The brass shackle resisted for a fraction of a second before yielding with a violent ear-splitting crack. The broken padlock hit the fiberglass deck and rolled away. I dropped the crowbar. It clattered loudly against the helm, but I did not care about scratching the mahogany anymore. The boat was no longer a vessel. It was a crime scene. I unlatched the heavy metal clasps on the sides of the green box and threw the lid open. The smell of old paper and dried leather wafted up, perfectly preserved by the watertight seal. Inside, resting perfectly in the center, was a thick black leather-bound ledger. Beneath the ledger was a large manila envelope sealed with red wax and stamped by a public notary. My hands moved with clinical detachment. I lifted the leather ledger first. It was heavy, its pages filled to the brim. I recognized the binding immediately. It was the same type of accounting ledger Diane used to balance the books for our family hardware business. For 30 years, she had been the unseen financial architect of our entire livelihood. When she stepped down 5 years ago, handing the financial reins over to Connor, she told me she was simply too tired to keep staring at spreadsheets. She told me she wanted to spend her remaining time breathing the fresh air of the marina and restoring the boat. I had believed her. I had watched her hand the keys to the office over to our son, believing I was witnessing the proud transition of a family legacy. I opened the thick leather cover of the ledger. The first page was dated 4 years ago, exactly 6 months after she had supposedly retired. It was entirely filled with Diane's immaculate, precise handwriting. But these were not notes about varnish or marine engines. They were bank routing numbers, offshore transfer receipts, and meticulous records of missing inventory. My eyes scanned the first column. I recognized the vendor names. I recognized the supply costs. But next to every legitimate business expense, Diane had written a second set of numbers in red ink. She had tracked phantom invoices. She had documented ghost accounts. The pages were a devastating, undeniable roadmap of systematic theft. The mystery of the stolen boat evaporated immediately, replaced by a far more dangerous reality. Connor had not just sold his mother's prized possession to fund a vacation. That was merely an act of arrogant entitlement. This ledger represented something entirely different. It was a weapon. Diane had not retired because she was tired. She had stepped down because she caught our son draining the lifeblood of our business to finance a lifestyle he had not earned. She had spent her final years quietly building an inescapable cage of evidence around him. I gently set the ledger down on the passenger seat and picked up the thick manila envelope. The red wax seal was unbroken. In the center, stamped in bold, dark ink, was the seal of a federal notary public. Written across the front in Diane's unmistakable script were 3 words: primary vessel title. The tension in my chest tightened like a steel cable. I stared at the sealed envelope, the cold reality of the situation clicking into place like the chamber of a loaded revolver. Connor had handed Gavin a signed bill of sale this morning. But Connor did not have the title. The true legal title had been buried inside this steel vault for years. By taking Gavin's money and forging a transfer of ownership, my son had crossed an invisible, fatal threshold. He had escalated his greed from simple family theft to a documented federal crime. I held the envelope in my hands, feeling the immense, heavy power of my late wife's final orchestration. The game had fundamentally changed. I was no longer a grieving father demanding an apology. I was the executioner holding the rope my son had just tied around his own neck. I sat in the captain's seat of the Chris Craft, the harsh fluorescent lights of the warehouse buzzing high above me. The heavy leather cover of the ledger lay open across my knees. The pages were thick yellowed at the edges and filled top to bottom with the precise, elegant cursive that had defined my wife's entire existence. For a long moment, I simply stared at the ink. It was like hearing her voice speak from the grave, clear and unwavering. To the rest of the world, Diane was a gentlewoman who loved restoring old wood and planting hydrangeas. But in the back office of Ford Hardware, she was an absolute force of nature. For 3 decades, I was the face of the business. I shook the hands, mixed the paint, and cut the lumber. But Diane was the spine. She was the financial architect who took a struggling corner store and built it into a local institution. She knew every penny that came in and every fraction of a cent that went out. Her mind was a steel trap for numbers. 5 years ago, she handed the keys to the accounting office over to Connor. It was right around the time she received her first terrible diagnosis. She told me she was simply too tired to look at spreadsheets anymore. She said she wanted to spend whatever time she had left smelling the lake air and working on her boat. I believed her. I watched our son step into her shoes, puffing out his chest, playing the role of the dutiful heir stepping up to save his aging parents. I had been so proud of him then. Now, looking at the pages of her hidden ledger, that pride turned into a sickening acidic rot in the pit of my stomach. The first few pages were a baseline. Diane had recorded the legitimate operating costs of the hardware store. I recognized the names of our wholesale suppliers, the utility companies, the payroll outputs. But as I turned to the second chapter of the book, a new narrative began to unfold. Alongside the standard black ink, Diane had begun writing in a sharp, vibrant red. I traced my calloused index finger down a column dated exactly 4 months after Connor took over the books. There was a recorded payment of $8,000 to a lumber distributor we had not used in over a decade. Next to it, in red ink, Diane had written the word Phantom. I turned the page. The red ink began to bleed across the ledger like a spreading infection. $10,000 diverted to a shell contractor. $15,000 logged as emergency structural repairs for the store roof, a roof that I knew for a fact had not been touched in 20 years. Month after month, year after year, Connor had been methodically draining the lifeblood of the business. He was writing checks to ghost vendors, burying the theft in layers of fabricated expenses, and routing the cash directly into his own pockets. The sheer scale of the embezzlement was staggering. I flipped through dozens of pages, the numbers blurring together into a mountain of stolen wealth. It was not a crime of desperation. It was a calculated parasitic feeding frenzy. And suddenly, the lifestyle my son and his wife flaunted made perfect, devastating sense. For years, Monica had paraded around our family gatherings, wrapped in designer labels that cost more than my first mortgage. She drove a pristine European sports car that she claimed was a lease while casually mocking the old reliable truck I had driven for 15 years. Connor had recently purchased a massive modern house in a gated subdivision, attributing his sudden wealth to savvy day trading and smart investments. They had treated me like a relic, a stubborn old fool who did not know how to enjoy the fruits of modern success. Monica would sip her imported wine at our dinner table, her eyes rolling every time I talked about the value of a hard-earned dollar. Connor would smirk, patting my shoulder, telling me I needed to relax and let him handle the heavy lifting. Every single sneer, every arrogant boast, every luxury vacation they took was funded by the sweat off my back and the slow, silent destruction of my life's work. They were not successful. They were leeches. I gripped the edges of the ledger until the leather creaked under my fingers. The betrayal was so profound, it physically ached, a deep, crushing pressure right behind my ribs. But the pain of Connor's theft was nothing compared to the heartbreaking reality of what Diane had endured to document it. I looked at the dates on the final pages. They corresponded to the last 6 months of her life. The cancer had spread to her bones by then. The doctors had put her on a heavy regimen of painkillers that left her weak and exhausted. I had begged her to stay in bed. I had begged her to rest. But she would wrap herself in a heavy sweater, walk out to the freezing garage, and lock the door behind her. I thought she was seeking peace. I thought she was finding comfort in the smell of the mahogany and the quiet isolation of the boat. I was wrong. My beautiful dying wife was going to war. While Connor sat in our air-conditioned office, arrogantly skimming thousands of dollars off the top, and laughing at our ignorance, Diane was sitting in a freezing garage fighting through unimaginable physical agony to audit his crimes. She was tracking his fake shell companies. She was cross-referencing wholesale receipts. She was meticulously building an airtight, irrefutable criminal case against her own flesh and blood. She never told me. She carried the devastating knowledge of our son's treachery entirely alone, refusing to shatter my heart while she was still alive. She endured the pain, the betrayal, and the sickness, channeling every last ounce of her fading energy into protecting my future. She knew that once she was gone, Connor would not stop until he had taken everything I had left. She built this hidden compartment not as a grave for her secrets, but as an armory for my survival. A hot, burning tear escaped my eye and dropped onto the thick paper, smudging a single red number. I wiped it away fiercely. there would be no more tears. Diane had not spent her final days crying, and neither would I. She had handed me a loaded weapon, and she expected me to use it. I closed the heavy leather ledger and set it gently beside me on the seat. The financial ruin Connor had orchestrated was meticulously documented, but a chilling thought suddenly pierced through my rising anger. The ledger proved he was stealing from the business, but it did not explain why Gavin had called me in such a panic this morning. Embezzlement was a family matter, something that would destroy the hardware store, but it had nothing to do with the vintage boat dealer standing nervously on the concrete floor below me. I reached back into the dark green lockbox. The thick manila envelope was still waiting at the bottom, heavy and sealed with red wax. I pulled it out, turning it over in my hands. The federal notary stamp caught the harsh warehouse light. Whatever Diane had placed inside this envelope was the final piece of the puzzle. It was the reason Connor's arrogant trip to Paris was about to become the biggest mistake of his miserable life. I broke the wax seal. I slid my fingers beneath the flap of the heavy manila envelope. The red wax crumbled under my touch, falling like dried blood onto the polished mahogany deck of the boat. I reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, printed on stiff, watermarked parchment. My eyes immediately locked onto the bold black lettering at the very top of the first page. It was the official certificate of title for the 1968 Chris Craft. But as I read the densely typed paragraphs below the heading, the breath completely caught in my throat. Diane had not simply left the boat in my name. She was far too intelligent and far too methodical to leave such a glaring vulnerability in her wake. She knew our son. She knew that a standard title could easily be forged, signed over by a desperate and greedy man entirely willing to mimic his dead mother's handwriting for a quick payout. So she had legally erased herself as the owner, and she had bypassed me entirely as the direct inheritor. According to the crisp stamped ink on the page before me, the vessel did not belong to Diane Ford, and it did not belong to Howard Ford. Exactly 6 months before her passing, during a time when Connor believed she was bedridden and incapacitated, Diane had transferred the full unencumbered ownership of the boat into a blind, irrevocable trust. I was listed as the sole trustee and the sole executor, meaning no living person could legally touch the asset without my physical presence and my notarized consent. By establishing an irrevocable trust, she had placed the boat behind an impenetrable legal fortress. It was entirely shielded from probate court, completely immune to family claims, and absolutely untouchable by our son. I stood perfectly still in the center of the warehouse. The fluorescent lights buzzed a low, steady hum overhead, but my mind was entirely consumed by the staggering surgical brilliance of my wife's final act. She had not just hidden the title to protect a piece of carved wood. She had intentionally laid a devastating snare. I turned my attention back to the dealer standing on the concrete floor below me. Gavin Reed was shifting his weight from side to side, his face slick with a cold, nervous sweat. He was watching me with the wide, terrified eyes of a man who suddenly realized he was standing directly on top of a landmine. "Gavin," I said, my voice dropping to an eerily calm register, "when my son brought this boat into your warehouse this morning, what exactly did he give you?" Gavin swallowed hard, his throat working convulsively as he struggled to find his words. "He gave me the keys and a standard bill of sale, Mr. Ford. He had a state title document. It looked completely authentic. It had his name listed as the primary inheritor, and it had what looked exactly like your wife's signature, transferring the property to him. I swear to you the paperwork looked flawless. I run these commercial background checks every single day of the week. Show it to me," I demanded. Gavin did not dare argue. He practically sprinted across the warehouse floor to a small glass-enclosed office near the main entrance. He returned a moment later, clutching a manila folder to his chest, eventually pulling out a single sheet of paper. His hands were shaking so violently that the paper rattled as he handed it up to me over the side of the boat. I looked down at the document my son had manufactured. It was a masterpiece of desperate deceit. Connor had somehow managed to procure a blank state title transfer form. He had perfectly forged his mother's signature on the seller line, dating it 2 weeks before she succumbed to her illness. He had confidently listed himself as the sole legal owner of the vessel. It was a bold, arrogant lie executed by a man who truly believed he was the smartest person in any room he walked into. But Connor did not know about the irrevocable trust. He did not know that the state title he had so carefully forged was entirely useless because the boat no longer legally existed in the standard state registry. "How did you pay him for the transaction?" I asked, keeping my eyes fixed on my son's forged signature. Gavin took a step back, wiping his wet forehead with the back of his sleeve. He said he needed the money immediately to secure a luxury travel booking for his anniversary. I authorized a direct wire transfer of $70,000 from our commercial corporate account directly into his personal checking account. The funds cleared the bank an hour before you showed up. A cold, absolute silence fell over the Chris craft. The puzzle pieces locked together in my mind with a sickening, lethal precision. My son had not just stolen a family heirloom from my garage. He had not just disrespected his mother's memory to fund a vain, extravagant trip to Paris for his greedy wife. By presenting a forged title document to a commercial dealer, Connor had committed a felony. But by accepting a $70,000 electronic wire transfer from a corporate entity across state banking lines for a completely fraudulent asset, he had crossed a devastating, unfixable legal boundary. My son had just committed federal wire fraud. He had handed the federal government a pristine, documented paper trail of his own destruction. The thick leather ledger sitting on the seat beside me already proved he had been embezzling thousands of dollars from our family business. That was a domestic dispute, a local corporate crime that I could potentially suppress or handle internally if I chose to protect him. But this new revelation changed the entire landscape. This was a severe federal offense carrying a mandatory prison sentence. Connor had placed his own head squarely on the chopping block, and Diane had made absolutely sure that I was the one holding the axe. Gavin was breathing heavily now, his panic finally boiling over into a frantic display. "Mr. Ford, this is a complete disaster," he stammered, his voice rising in pitch and echoing off the metal walls. "I just wired $70,000 for stolen property. I have to call the police right now. I have to call the authorities and report the fraud before my business is implicated in a federal crime." "No," I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried a dense, heavy weight that stopped Gavin dead in his tracks. He stared at me, completely bewildered by my command. "What do you mean, no?" Gavin protested, waving his arms. "Your son committed massive fraud. He stole from you and he stole from me. We have to report this immediately." I folded the forged bill of sale and slipped it inside the manila envelope right next to Diane's legitimate trust documents. Then I picked up the heavy leather ledger from the passenger seat and tucked it firmly under my right arm. I looked down at the dealer, my expression hardening into stone. "Gavin, you are going to get every single penny of your money back," I told him, my eyes boring into his terrified face. "And I am going to get my boat back. But if you call the police right now, my son will immediately hire a defense attorney. He will drag this out in the court system for years. He will hide the money he stole from you, and he will muddy the waters until nobody knows the truth. I am not going to let him do that. He thought he could erase his mother and treat me like a senile, invisible old fool. I am going to handle this my way, and I am going to do it today." I climbed down the aluminum boarding ladder, my boots hitting the solid concrete floor with a heavy, purposeful thud. I did not feel like a 70-year-old retired hardware store owner anymore. I felt like a soldier stepping onto a battlefield armed with the most dangerous ammunition in the world. "Do not touch this boat," I ordered Gavin as I walked past him toward the open warehouse door. "Do not move it. Do not clean it. Do not tell a single living soul that I was here this afternoon. I am going to see my attorney." I walked out into the harsh afternoon sunlight. The air smelled strongly of diesel exhaust and salt, but for the first time in 5 years, my lungs felt completely clear. Connor and Monica were likely arriving at the international airport by now, toasting to their own brilliance, drinking expensive champagne paid for by the ghost of my wife. They thought they had won the game. They thought they had left me behind in the dust to rot. They had absolutely no idea that the trap had already snapped shut around their ankles. The drive from the industrial marina to the downtown business district took 30 minutes. I did not call the local police. The thought crossed my mind for a fraction of a second, but I immediately dismissed it. Local authorities were blunt instruments. If I sent a squad car to my son's expensive house, they would treat it as a domestic dispute or a civil matter. Connor would post bail within the hour. He would hire a slick defense attorney who would drag the proceedings through the municipal courts for years. He would use that time to hide the money he stole from the hardware store and paint me as a confused, grieving widower. I did not want a slow, messy legal battle. I wanted total, absolute devastation. I needed a surgical strike, and for that I needed Arthur Lawson. Lawson was not a friendly neighborhood lawyer. He was a ruthless, brilliant estate attorney who had built his career protecting the assets of wealthy clients from parasitic relatives. Diane and I had retained him decades ago. He was the man who had helped my wife quietly establish the irrevocable blind trust. He knew exactly how my family operated, and he knew the full extent of Diane's meticulous financial planning. I parked my truck illegally in front of the towering glass and steel building that housed Lawson's firm. I did not care about a parking ticket. I gripped the heavy black leather ledger in my left hand and the thick manila envelope containing the trust documents and the forged bill of sale in my right. The lobby was a sprawling expanse of white marble and polished chrome. I bypassed the security desk entirely. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending to a mountaintop battlefield. When the polished silver doors slid open, I walked straight past the waiting area. The receptionist, a young woman in a crisp blazer, stood up from her desk and called out my name, trying to stop me. She told me Mr. Lawson was in a conference call and could not be disturbed. I did not break my stride. I marched down the long carpeted hallway and pushed open the heavy mahogany doors to Lawson's corner office. Arthur Lawson was sitting behind a massive desk, speaking into a phone headset. He was a man in his late 60s, with silver hair and eyes like chipped flint. He looked up, ready to reprimand whoever had dared to interrupt his meeting. But the moment his eyes locked onto my face, the annoyance instantly vanished. He saw the cold, dead expression I wore. He saw the heavy leather ledger gripped in my fist. He raised a finger, pressed a button on his desk phone to end his call, and slowly took off his headset. "Howard," he said, his voice completely devoid of the usual professional pleasantries. "What has happened?" I did not offer a greeting. I walked to the center of the room and threw the thick black ledger onto the pristine surface of his mahogany desk. It landed with a heavy, commanding thud. Then I tossed the manila envelope right on top of it. "Connor sold the Chris Craft this morning," I said, my voice flat and mechanical. "He hauled it out of my garage while I was buying hardware. He sold it to Gavin Reed down at the commercial marina for $70,000 because Monica wanted to go to Paris for their anniversary." Lawson did not gasp. He did not offer empty condolences. He simply leaned forward, his sharp eyes darting from my face to the documents resting on his desk. He reached out and picked up the manila envelope. He pulled out the forged bill of sale I had confiscated from Gavin. He signed a standard state title transfer. I continued my words, falling like heavy stones in the quiet office. He forged Diane's signature. He took the money via an electronic wire transfer from a corporate account. But he did not know what Diane spent her final months doing. He did not know about the hidden compartment behind the helm. And he absolutely did not know that the boat no longer existed in the state registry. Lawson opened the authentic trust document Diane had sealed in wax. He placed it side by side with the forged bill of sale. I watched his mind work, watching him process the catastrophic legal collision my son had just orchestrated. Howard Lawson said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "This is not just a stolen boat. The moment Diane placed this vessel into the irrevocable blind trust, it ceased to be personal property. It became a protected federal entity. You are the sole executor. Connor bypassed your authority and generated a fraudulent state document to initiate a commercial sale. He picked up the heavy leather ledger and opened it to the first page. He saw the columns of numbers. He saw the vibrant red ink Diane had used to document the phantom invoices and the stolen inventory from our hardware store. He slowly turned page after page, his face growing paler with every calculated theft he uncovered. Diane had laid out a perfect, irrefutable map of Connor's embezzlement. It was decades of corporate theft meticulously proven by the very woman who gave birth to him. He has been bleeding the store dry, I told him, staring blankly at the wall behind Lawson's head. She caught him. She stepped down from the accounting office so she could spend her dying days building a cage around him. She knew he would eventually steal the boat to fund Monica's lifestyle. She hid the true title inside the hull, knowing the dealer would find it and call me. She handed me the rope, Lawson. Now I want you to tell me exactly how tight it is. Lawson closed the ledger. He folded his hands together and looked at me with a terrifying, solemn clarity. If Connor had simply backed his truck up and stolen cash from your safe, it would be a local theft, Lawson explained deliberately. But he accepted a $70,000 commercial wire transfer across state banking networks for an asset he did not own, using a forged signature on a state document. That triggers federal jurisdiction, Howard. This is interstate wire fraud. It is federal forgery. And combined with this ledger, it proves a pattern of systemic corporate embezzlement. I stood frozen, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the destruction. If we hand this file over to the district attorney right now, Lawson continued, Connor will not just get a slap on the wrist. The federal prosecutors will seize his assets. They will freeze his bank accounts. He is looking at a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. His life as a free, wealthy man is completely over. Do you understand what I am telling you, Howard? There is no walking back from this once we set the wheels in motion. I did not flinch. I thought about the empty space in my garage. I thought about my wife shivering in the cold, gripping a sanding block, while her body consumed itself. I thought about Connor standing in the driveway, telling me to get over her death, so his greedy wife could drink champagne in Paris. He had shown me absolutely no mercy. He had stripped away my dignity and spat on the sacred memory of his mother. I had no mercy left to give. I understand perfectly, I replied, my voice echoing with absolute finality. He wanted to play the game of a wealthy man. Now he is going to pay the price. I do not want you to call the police yet, Lawson. I want to wait. They are boarding a flight to France tonight. I want him to land in a foreign country, believing he has won. I want you to prepare the financial guillotine. Lawson nodded slowly, but as he opened his computer terminal to begin cross-referencing the bank routing numbers from Diane's ledger, his hands suddenly stopped typing. He stared at the glowing screen, his eyes narrowing into a tight, vicious squint. The air in the room grew heavy and cold. He looked up at me, and the expression on his face told me the nightmare was not even close to being over. Howard, he said, his voice laced with a new creeping dread. We have a much bigger problem. Connor did not just steal from the store. You need to look at what he did to your house. Arthur Lawson did not speak for a long time. The only sound in his sprawling corner office was the frantic rhythmic tapping of his keyboard and the sharp, deliberate click of his mouse. He had Diane's heavy leather ledger open flat on his mahogany desk, his eyes darting relentlessly between her meticulous red handwriting and the glowing financial records displayed on his dual monitors. I sat across from him, feeling the high-voltage adrenaline from the marina slowly morph into a dense, suffocating dread. Lawson was a man who thrived in brutal courtroom battles. He routinely dismantled hostile corporate takeovers and vicious family disputes. He simply did not rattle. Seeing the color gradually drain from his weathered face was far more terrifying than any verbal threat Connor could have ever made. Howard Lawson finally said, his voice stripped of all its usual booming courtroom authority. I need you to brace yourself. Diane caught the embezzlement. She documented the ghost vendors, the fake supply invoices, and the offshore routing numbers flawlessly. She mapped out exactly how Connor was bleeding your hardware store dry. But she passed away before she could see what he did next. What did he do? I asked. My voice felt entirely disconnected from my body, like it belonged to a stranger in the room. Lawson reached out and physically turned his large monitor so I could see the screen. It was a digital labyrinth of bank statements and property records highlighted with glaring red flags that perfectly mirrored my late wife's ink. Connor realized the hardware store was bleeding out too quickly. Lawson explained, pointing a heavy finger at a massive, terrifying transaction log. The business accounts were drying up because he was siphoning them at an unsustainable rate. He needed a massive immediate influx of cash to maintain the illusion of his wealth, to keep paying for Monica's luxury cars, her country club memberships, and the designer clothes. So he bypassed traditional lending. He went to a private shadow lender. They are a predatory firm that does not ask any questions regarding income verification, as long as the physical collateral is absolutely ironclad. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process the sheer volume of zeros attached to the principal loan agreement. What collateral did he use? I asked, a cold, creeping panic crawling up my spine. He does not own his own home outright. His estate is mortgaged to the hilt. He drives leased vehicles. He has no tangible assets. He used your house, Howard, Lawson said. The words hung in this quiet office, suffocating and absolute. I stopped breathing. The ambient noise of the city outside the glass window completely vanished. My vision blurred for a fraction of a second as the floor seemed to drop out from beneath my feet. He used my house, I repeated the concept, entirely failing to compute in my brain. How is that even legally possible, Arthur? The deed is strictly in my name. I paid that mortgage off 15 years ago. Lawson pulled a freshly printed document from a stack on his desk and pushed it toward me. Because 5 years ago, when Diane first received her terminal diagnosis, you signed a comprehensive, durable power of attorney over to Connor. You did it to allow him to manage the business logistics and handle the overwhelming medical insurance claims so you could focus entirely on taking care of your dying wife. You trusted your only son to hold down the family fort while you prepared to say goodbye to the love of your life. The memory hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow. I remembered that specific day in the hospital cafeteria. I had barely slept in a week, surviving on stale coffee and sheer willpower. Connor had walked in wearing a sympathetic expression, carrying a stack of legal papers. He told me I needed to sign them so he could keep the hardware store running without bothering me for every little signature while Mom was suffering. He had looked me right in the eye, squeezed my shoulder tightly, and told me to just focus on Mom because he had everything else under control. He had weaponized my profound grief before my wife was even in the ground. He invoked that specific power of attorney exactly 4 months after Diane passed away. Lawson continued, his voice now vibrating with a suppressed lethal rage. He took out a massive equity line of credit against your primary residence. He completely drained the equity you and Diane spent 40 years breaking your backs to build. And he funneled every single penny of it through his anonymous shell companies to pay off his own mounting personal debts. I felt physically violently ill. The home where we had raised him, the living room where he took his very first steps, the kitchen where Diane taught him how to bake his favorite cookies. He had literally sold the roof over my head to keep his greedy, arrogant wife dripping in imported diamonds. But the nightmare was not finished. Lawson leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk and clasping his hands tightly together. Howard, it gets exponentially worse, he said grimly. Connor has not made a single payment on this shadow loan in over 6 months. He is in total, complete default. The private lender has officially initiated the foreclosure process. I am looking at the legal filings in the county database right now. They have bypassed all the standard warning protocols because of the aggressive nature of the shadow loan contract he signed on your behalf. What does that mean? I demanded, my hands gripping the armrests of the leather chair so tightly my joints popped. It means you have exactly 30 days, Lawson stated, the words falling like the blade of a guillotine. 30 days before the bank sends a county sheriff to your front door to physically evict you from the premises. They will seize the property, auction it off to the highest bidder to recover Connor's massive debt, and they will leave you with absolutely nothing. You will be entirely homeless by the end of next month. The pristine walls of the law office felt like they were rapidly closing in, crushing the oxygen out of my lungs. Connor had not just stolen a vintage boat. He had not just bankrupted a family business. He had deliberately, calculatingly, and systematically engineered my total financial ruin. While he was booking first-class airline tickets to Paris and making dinner reservations at Michelin-starred restaurants, he knew perfectly well that his own father was 30 days away from being thrown out onto the street. He was perfectly willing to let me lose my sanctuary and freeze in the dark, all so he would not have to admit to Monica that he was a profound failure. The sheer unadulterated evil of his calculation was breathtaking. I had not just raised an entitled son. I had raised a ruthless apex predator. Lawson was watching me closely, waiting for the inevitable emotional breakdown. He was bracing for the tears, the panic, the desperate pleas for a legal miracle to save my home. He reached across the desk, offering a deeply sympathetic look. "Howard, we can fight this," Lawson said, his tone softening slightly. "We can file an emergency injunction tomorrow morning. We can claim extreme fraud and flagrant abuse of the power of attorney. It will be a long, brutal legal war. It will drain whatever meager savings you have left, and it will drag your family name through the mud. But we might be able to stall the eviction process. We can call the federal authorities right now and have him arrested in handcuffs the exact moment he touches back down on American soil." I looked away from the glowing computer screen and stared out the large glass window. Far below, the city moved in a chaotic, oblivious rhythm. But inside my mind, the storm of betrayal suddenly evaporated. The panic was gone. The sorrow was entirely gone. The loving father who had blindly trusted his son had died in the empty garage this morning. The man who remained sitting in this chair was entirely hollowed out, leaving only a cold, calculating vacuum of pure retribution. Connor thought he had outsmarted me. He thought the power of attorney gave him an impenetrable shield to hide behind, while I lost everything. But he had forgotten one crucial detail. He had forgotten that he was dealing with the man who built the empire he was currently tearing down. "No injunctions," I said, turning my head slowly back to Lawson. My voice was completely steady, resonating with a terrifying absolute calm. No long, drawn-out legal battles, and absolutely no police. Lawson frowned, his brilliant legal mind visibly struggling to comprehend my absolute refusal to defend myself through standard channels. "Then how do we stop the bank from taking your home, Howard?" "We do not just stop the bank," I replied. "We sever the parasite completely." I watched Arthur Lawson type. The clatter of his keyboard filled the silence of the office. My mind was no longer in the room. I was thinking about my house. I thought about the heavy oak front door I had hung with my own 2 hands 40 years ago. I thought about the scuff marks on the hardwood floor in the hallway where Connor used to slide in his socks when he was a boy. I thought about the garden out back, where Diane had planted her prized rose bushes. Every inch of that property was saturated with the blood and sweat of our shared life. And my son had mortgaged it all away to a shadow lender. He had effectively stolen the floorboards out from under my feet. The sheer audacity of the crime brought a sickening wave of clarity. I remembered our last family Thanksgiving dinner. Monica had arrived wearing a pristine white silk coat and a pair of imported leather boots that cost more than a reliable used car. She had sat at my dining room table drinking my wine, and she had spent the entire evening making thinly veiled comments about my lifestyle. She laughed at my frayed work boots. She told me it was tragic that I refused to update my outdated kitchen appliances. She said I was clinging to a cheap, depressing past because I was too stubborn to embrace modern wealth. She had sat in my dining room mocking my frugality while her entire luxurious existence was being funded by the equity of the very room we were sitting in. She bought her imported boots by secretly selling off the roof over my head. The sickening reality of her arrogance was almost hard to swallow. Connor had sat right next to her carving the turkey, playing the role of the successful entrepreneur, fully aware that he had already signed the paperwork that would eventually throw me out onto the street. They had treated me like a pathetic, stingy old man, while they acted as parasites quietly gorging themselves on my life savings. Lawson stopped typing. He leaned closer to his monitor, his eyes scanning a newly populated list of financial transactions. Diane had provided the exact routing numbers for the offshore shell companies Connor was using to launder the hardware store funds. With those account numbers, Lawson had gained direct access to the digital trail of my son's recent expenditures. The bleeding had not stopped. It was happening right now in real time. Howard Lawson said, his voice tight with disbelief. I am looking at the live transaction history for his primary dummy account. He linked a high-limit platinum credit card directly to the stolen funds. The charges are rolling in as we speak. Tell me where they are, I said. Lawson read the screen. 3 hours ago, a charge cleared for an executive black car service from his house to the international airport. 2 hours ago, there was a massive transaction at the first-class ticketing counter for a major European airline. They upgraded their seats to the private luxury suites. 45 minutes ago, a charge appeared for an exclusive airport lounge. He just bought 2 bottles of vintage champagne. They are celebrating, I murmured, feeling a cold, absolute calm wash over my entire nervous system. They are sitting in a private lounge right now, drinking expensive champagne, waiting to board a transatlantic flight to Paris. They think they have completely gotten away with it. Lawson turned his chair to face me. His hands were folded tightly in his lap. The flight to Paris boards in 20 minutes, he stated, glancing at the gold watch on his wrist. They will be in the air for 10 hours. We have a 10-hour window where they will be entirely disconnected from the world. We can use this time to contact the federal authorities. We can have a warrant issued for his arrest. Interpol can detain him the exact second his feet touch French soil. We can freeze the dummy accounts and stop the bleeding before they spend another dime in Europe. I stared at the heavy mahogany desk. I stared at Diane's leather ledger and the forged bill of sale resting next to it. I pictured Connor and Monica sitting in their plush first-class seats clinking crystal glasses together as the plane soared over the Atlantic Ocean. I pictured them planning their luxury shopping sprees and their fine dining experiences entirely secure in the delusion of their own untouchable brilliance. If we arrest him now, he becomes a victim of circumstance, I said slowly. If we freeze the accounts while he is in the air, he will just call a lawyer from the detention center. He will use his remaining connections to post bail. He will try to negotiate a plea deal. I do not want him negotiating anything. I want him to feel exactly what I am feeling right now. I want him to experience the absolute terrifying freefall of losing everything he thought he owned. Lawson watched me carefully. He was a man who understood the mechanics of legal vengeance better than anyone. What exactly are you asking me to do, Howard? I pointed to the computer screen. He built his entire fraudulent empire on a house of cards. He used the hardware store money to fund the dummy accounts, and he used my house as collateral for a loan he has completely defaulted on. The only thing keeping him afloat right now is the illusion that those accounts are still active and that the bank has not officially seized the collateral. I leaned forward, planting my hands firmly on the edge of the desk. I want you to initiate the irrevocable trust protocols for the boat I instructed. I want the Federal Registry to automatically flag the forged title he gave the dealer this morning. Let the federal system quietly digest the wire fraud. Then I want you to contact the shadow lender holding the fraudulent mortgage on my house. Do not ask for an injunction. Do not ask them to delay the foreclosure. I want you to formally notify them that the primary borrower is fleeing the country with stolen assets. Lawson's eyes widened slightly as the sheer brutality of my strategy clicked into place. If I notify the shadow lender that Connor has committed fraud and is currently fleeing international borders, they will not wait 30 days to evict you, he warned softly. They will immediately trigger the catastrophic default clauses in the loan agreement. They will instantly freeze every single financial asset tied to his social security number to mitigate their losses. They will drain his personal checking accounts. They will freeze his credit cards, and they will completely obliterate his financial identity before the sun sets today. Do it! I said, my voice as hard and unforgiving as solid iron. Lawson did not look away. But Howard, if I do this, it will destroy you too. The bank will move on your house immediately. You will lose the property by the end of the week. I already lost the house, Arthur, I replied, feeling the absolute truth of the words settle into my bones. The house is just wood and glass. Diane is gone. The family we built inside those walls is completely dead. I am not trying to save a building. I am trying to destroy a monster. I stood up from the leather chair. The heavy dread that had been sitting on my chest was gone, replaced by a dark, consuming energy. Let them board the plane. Let them drink their champagne and fly across the ocean wrapped in stolen luxury. When they land in Paris, they will try to use those platinum cards to check into their 5-star hotel. And that is when they will discover that the accounts are dead. That is when they will realize they have no money, no home, no hardware store, and absolutely no way back. Lawson slowly nodded his head. He turned back to his keyboard. The rapid clicking sound resumed, echoing like the ticking of a bomb. The trap was set. The timer had started. My son was flying directly into his own execution. Lawson watched his computer monitor as the flight status updated in real time. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair and folded his hands carefully in his lap. He told me the boarding process had just begun at the international terminal. He said one simple phone call to the Port Authority police could have them pulled out of the first-class line immediately. He explained that federal agents could intercept them at the gate before they even set foot on the plane. He looked at me with those sharp, flinty eyes and asked me directly if I wanted him to make that call. I looked at the manila envelope resting on his pristine desk. I thought about the forged signature my son had so easily penned. I thought about the shadow loan that was slowly consuming my home while I was completely unaware. I slowly shook my head. I told Lawson to keep his phone on the desk. If I sent the police to the airport, Connor would immediately play the victim. He would act outraged and confused in front of the terminal crowd. He would use his remaining credit lines to hire a high-profile defense attorney before he even reached the police precinct. He would sit in a holding cell and try to negotiate a favorable settlement using the very money he had stolen from my dying wife. I did not want him negotiating anything. I did not want him sitting in a comfortable local precinct plotting his legal defense and calling in favors from his wealthy friends. I wanted him to feel the exact same suffocating helplessness that Diane must have felt when she realized her own son was a parasite. I wanted the ground to completely vanish from beneath his feet without a single warning. Let them get on the plane, I said. My voice was low and perfectly calm. The steadiness of my own tone surprised me. Let them settle into their luxury seats and drink their complimentary champagne. They think they are flying toward a romantic vacation funded by their own incredible brilliance. I want them to enjoy every single second of that 10-hour flight over the Atlantic Ocean. Lawson stared at me with a mixture of professional respect and quiet caution. He asked what I wanted him to do instead. I told him to drop the financial guillotine. I instructed him to contact the primary financial institutions holding our corporate hardware store accounts. I told him to invoke my status as the primary founder and present the overwhelming evidence of extreme corporate fraud. I wanted every single bank account associated with Connor's name completely locked down. I told Lawson to revoke the durable power of attorney immediately and flag every credit card Connor had drawn from the business as stolen. I wanted the digital pipelines severed instantly and permanently. Lawson did not hesitate for a second. He picked up his desk phone and began making the calls. He had direct lines to the executive fraud departments of the major national banks. I sat in silence and listened to him work. His voice was sharp and surgical. He provided my authorization codes and cited the exact federal statutes regarding unauthorized asset liquidation. He sent secure digital copies of the forged bill of sale and Diane's meticulous ledger directly to the fraud investigators. I watched his fingers move rapidly across the keyboard as he initiated the lockdown protocols. It was a strangely quiet process. There were no sirens screaming in the distance. There were no shouting police officers or dramatic courtroom gavels. The complete destruction of my son's stolen empire was happening through the silent, invisible transmission of data. I listened as Lawson confirmed the freezing of the primary corporate checking account. A minute later, he confirmed the immediate suspension of the Platinum business credit cards. He moved methodically through the list like an assassin. He locked the savings accounts. He flagged the offshore routing numbers Diane had uncovered. He contacted the Federal Registry to officially report the vessel title as compromised by severe wire fraud. Every time Lawson clicked his mouse, another steel door slammed shut on Connor's life. The wealth he had arrogantly flaunted at our family dinners was evaporating into thin air. The money he had used to buy Monica's designer clothes and finance his massive estate was instantly neutralized. By the time the boarding doors closed on their transatlantic flight, my son was entirely bankrupt. He just did not know it yet. I pictured the airplane taxiing down the runway. I imagined Monica smiling as the massive engines roared, completely oblivious to the fact that the luxurious life she felt so entitled to was already dead. They were traveling in a pressurized metal tube, 30,000 feet in the air, entirely cut off from the global banking network. They had no cellular service to receive the automated fraud alerts. They had no way of knowing that their designer digital wallets were now filled with absolutely useless plastic. Lawson hung up his phone and turned his monitor back toward me. The screens that had previously displayed hundreds of thousands of dollars in available credit now showed a cascading wall of red suspension notices. The financial freeze was absolute. Connor was locked out of everything. "It is done," Howard Lawson said quietly. "The accounts are completely frozen. The credit cards will decline every single transaction from this second forward. The fraud investigation has been officially triggered at the federal level." I nodded slowly. I felt no remorse. I only felt the cold, heavy weight of justice finally settling into place. I told Lawson that when that flight lands in Paris, the real nightmare will begin for them. I thought about the exact moment it would happen. They would walk through the opulent glass doors of their five-star hotel. Monica would likely demand a room upgrade or order an expensive bottle of wine to the suite. Connor would confidently hand his platinum card to the concierge. He would wait for the respectful smile and the nod of approval. Instead, he would watch the desk clerk frown at the terminal screen. The machine would decline the transaction. Connor would act offended and embarrassed. He would hand over a second card, claiming it was just a simple banking error. That card would also decline. He would try a third and a fourth. Panic would slowly begin to creep into his chest as the truth began to dawn on him. They would be standing in the lobby of a foreign hotel thousands of miles from home with absolutely no money. They would have no way to pay for a room. They would have no way to buy a meal. They would not even be able to purchase a return ticket to the United States. They would be stranded on the streets of a city they thought they owned. And when Connor finally swallowed his pride and managed to find a phone to call his bank, he would not reach a helpful customer service representative. He would be transferred directly to a federal fraud investigator. He would be informed that he was the primary suspect in a massive embezzlement and forgery case. He would learn that his home was actively in foreclosure and that his father had handed the undeniable proof of his crimes over to the authorities. He would realize that the silent, weak old man he had so casually discarded had engineered his total, absolute ruin. Lawson asked if I wanted him to arrange a private security detail for my house in case Connor tried to retaliate once he found a way back to the country. I told him it was not necessary. Connor was a coward who hid behind stolen money and forged signatures. Without his wealth, he was nothing. He would not come back looking for a fight. He would come back looking for mercy. And I had none left to give. I stood up from the heavy leather chair, feeling a profound, chilling clarity. I thanked Lawson for his ruthless efficiency and walked out of the office. The war was not over, but the heaviest blow had been struck. I sat perfectly still in the center of the dark living room. The only light came from the pale yellow glow of the street lamp outside filtering through the gaps in the front window blinds. The heavy leather ledger rested on my lap. I traced the worn edges of the binding with my thumb, feeling the textured surface that Diane had touched so many times. The house was completely silent. It was the kind of deep, suffocating silence that follows a funeral. I had spent the last 10 hours preparing for this exact moment. I did not turn on the television. I did not pour myself a glass of water. I did not even turn on a lamp. I simply sat in the darkness and waited for the inevitable collision. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times. It was exactly 3:00 in the morning. The sudden shrill ring of my cell phone shattered the quiet air. The bright screen illuminated the dark room, casting long, harsh shadows across the walls. The caller ID flashed Connor's name. I stared at the glowing white letters for several seconds, letting it ring 3 times before I finally picked it up. I pressed the cold phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply breathed into the receiver and waited for my son to speak. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" Connor's voice came through the speaker, loud and frantic. There was no greeting. There was no asking if he had woken me up in the middle of the night. He sounded completely breathless and on the edge of total panic. "I am standing in the lobby of the Hôtel de Crillon in Paris. We just landed 2 hours ago, and I am trying to check into our suite, but every single one of my cards is declining. Did you forget to authorize the international travel notification on the corporate accounts before I left?" I could hear the chaotic background noise of a busy foreign hotel lobby through the phone. I heard the faint sound of people speaking French, the clinking of brass luggage carts rolling across marble floors, and the low murmur of wealthy travelers. I could picture the scene perfectly. Connor standing at the polished front desk, wearing his expensive designer travel clothes, sweating profusely, while a sharply dressed Parisian concierge looked at him with polite professional disdain. Monica was probably standing a few feet away, tapping her expensive leather shoes and holding her breath in absolute embarrassment. Their perfect, arrogant facade was cracking in front of strangers. "I did not authorize anything, Connor," I replied, my voice perfectly level and entirely stripped of any warmth or paternal affection. "I did not call the bank for you." "Well, you need to call them right now, Dad," he snapped, his arrogance desperately masking a rising tide of genuine terror. "This is completely humiliating." The clerk ran the primary platinum card twice and it came back as entirely restricted. So I handed him the secondary business card and the terminal seized it. It literally told the clerk to confiscate the physical card. "Monica is having a severe panic attack in the lobby. We have been traveling for 10 hours and we just want to get up to our room and rest. You have to call the fraud department immediately and tell them to lift the security freeze on my accounts." I did not move from my chair. I let my eyes adjust further to the darkness of the living room, staring at the faint outline of the coffee table. "It is not a security freeze, Connor," I told him, speaking slowly so every single word would land with maximum destructive impact. "The accounts are completely dead. I sat in Arthur Lawson's office yesterday afternoon. I had the bank permanently lock the primary checking and cancel every single line of credit attached to your name. The money is gone." The line went dead silent for a fraction of a second after I told him the money was gone. I could hear the erratic rhythm of Connor's breathing through the speaker. He was a cornered animal trying to calculate his next move. He had spent the last 5 years believing I was nothing more than an oblivious old man waiting to die. He thought he held every single card in the deck. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost the desperate, pleading tone. It hardened into something incredibly ugly and vicious. He dropped the act of the victimized son and brought out the weapon he had been saving for this exact moment. "Listen to me very carefully, Dad." Connor said, his words dripping with a cold, calculated venom. "You are going to call Arthur Lawson right now and undo whatever psychotic mess you just created. You are going to authorize a wire transfer to my personal account so Monica and I can leave this lobby. If you do not do exactly as I say, I will call my attorney in the morning. I still hold the durable power of attorney you signed. I will have a judge declare you mentally unfit by the end of the week. I will tell the court that the grief of losing Mom has finally driven you completely senile. I will have you forcibly removed from that house and placed in a locked assisted living facility before you even know what hit you. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life sitting in a wheelchair staring at a wall while I liquidate every single asset you ever owned. Do not test me, old man. I will take everything. I sat in the darkness of the living room and let his threat hang in the stagnant air. 10 years ago, those words would have broken my heart. 5 years ago, they would have made me question my own sanity. But tonight, they meant absolutely nothing. They were just the hollow, empty threats of a parasite who had finally been severed from his host. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. The time for anger had completely passed. I was operating with a lethal surgical calmness. I reached down and rested my hand on the heavy leather cover of Diane's ledger. I opened it to a page I had marked earlier in the afternoon. The yellow streetlight from the window illuminated the sharp red ink my wife had pressed into the paper. "You do not hold the power of attorney, Connor," I replied, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. "Arthur Lawson legally revoked it 3 hours ago using the emergency fraud statutes. You have absolutely no authority over my health, my estate, or my finances. You have nothing. But since you want to talk about liquidating assets, let us talk about your accounting skills. I want you to listen to me very carefully." Connor tried to interrupt me, but I did not stop speaking. My voice cut through his panicked protests like a serrated blade. "On October 12th of last year, you authorized a corporate check for $14,000, I read aloud, keeping my tone entirely devoid of emotion. You logged it in the company ledger as a bulk purchase of winter weatherization supplies from a wholesale distributor called Apex Industrial. But there is no Apex Industrial, Connor. It is a registered shell company operating out of a strip mall post office box in Delaware. The money did not buy salt or shovels. It went directly into an offshore account that pays the monthly lease on your luxury sports car." "Dad, shut up," Connor stammered, his voice suddenly trembling with a raw, naked terror. I turned the heavy page of the ledger. The paper made a dry, scraping sound in the silent room. "On March 3rd of this year, you drafted a payment for $22,000, I continued, speaking directly over his frantic breathing. "You categorized it as an emergency structural repair for the hardware store's loading dock. You even generated a fake invoice from a local masonry firm. But the loading dock was never touched. That $22,000 was routed through a third-party payment processor to cover the initiation fee for Monica's exclusive country club membership." "Stop it," Connor pleaded, the arrogance completely draining out of him, leaving only a hollow, panicked shell. "I do not know what you are looking at, but it is a lie. You are confused." I turned one more page, tracing my finger over Diane's immaculate handwriting. I felt a profound sense of pride in my late wife. She had sat in the freezing garage dying of bone cancer, and she had systematically dismantled the man who was stealing our legacy. On July 17th, I read the words carrying the final, crushing weight of absolute judgment. "You drained $50,000 directly from our emergency operational reserve. You did not even bother to hide it behind a fake vendor that time. You simply labeled it as an executive bonus allocation. That was exactly 4 days after the doctors told us your mother's cancer was terminal. You sat in my kitchen, ate the dinner I cooked for you, and told me you were working late to keep the business afloat while we dealt with the medical bills. You stole $50,000 from a dying woman so you could put a down payment on a luxury cabin cruiser. You bought a boat with the money meant for her hospice care." A long, agonizing silence stretched across the transatlantic connection. I could hear the faint sound of Monica asking Connor a question in the background, her voice sharp and annoyed. I heard Connor tell her to shut up. He was suffocating. The walls of his perfect, untouchable world had just completely collapsed. He realized in that singular, devastating moment that I was not looking at a few confusing bank statements. He realized I was holding a fully documented, meticulously researched map of his entire criminal enterprise. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking into a pathetic, dry sob. "Mom did this. Your mother spent her final months building your prison, Connor." I told him the absolute truth, settling over him like a burial shroud. "She knew exactly what you were. She knew you were a greedy, entitled coward who would drain this family dry the second she was gone. She did not hand over the books because she was tired. She stepped aside so she could audit every single theft you committed. She hid this ledger inside the helm of her boat, knowing you would eventually try to sell it. She set the trap, Connor, and you walked right into it with a smile on your face. Dad, I am sorry." Connor wept, completely abandoning any pretense of control. I was going to put the money back. The business was just so stressful, and Monica was always demanding more. I got in too deep. "Please, you cannot give those records to the authorities. They will lock me up. I will lose everything. You are my father. You have to protect me. You forfeited the right to call me your father the day you mortgaged the house I built to pay your shadow loans." I said, my voice entirely devoid of mercy. "You threatened to throw me in a locked ward. You told me you would take everything. You wanted a war, Connor. Now you have one. But you do not have any ammunition left. The federal fraud investigators already have the digital copies of the ledger and the forged bill of sale you gave the boat dealer. There is no negotiation. There is no bailout. You are entirely on your own." I pulled the phone away from my ear. I could hear his hysterical screaming coming through the small speaker, but I did not listen to the words. I pressed the red button and ended the call. I sat in the darkness for a long time, holding Diane's ledger against my chest. The house was quiet again, but the heavy, suffocating silence of grief had finally lifted. It was replaced by the clean, sharp air of absolute justice. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, I felt like I could actually breathe. The phone lit up again, almost the exact second I ended the call. The bright screen pierced the darkness of my living room, throwing harsh shadows across the walls. Connor was calling back. I sat perfectly still and watched his name flash silently on the display. I did not reach for the device. I simply let it vibrate against the wooden coffee table until it went to voicemail. It rang a second time, and then a third time. He was relentless. The sudden evaporation of his power had sent him into a blind, chaotic frenzy. He had spent the last 5 years dictating every term of my life, and now he was completely locked out. He was pounding on a door that would never open again. After the 4th missed call, the notifications for new voice messages began to appear. I picked up the phone and pressed the speaker button, allowing his desperate voice to fill the quiet room. His first message was entirely consumed by rage. He was screaming into the receiver, demanding that I pick up the phone immediately. He told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. He swore he would fly back to the United States and tear the house apart if I did not wire him the money right that second. He threatened to call the police on me, claiming I had stolen his legitimate business assets. It was a pathetic display of a spoiled child throwing a tantrum because his toys had been taken away. He still believed he could intimidate me with volume and empty threats. I deleted the message and played the next one. This call had come 10 minutes later, and the tone had drastically shifted. The furious screaming was gone. It was replaced by the rapid, shallow breathing of a man who was finally grasping the absolute reality of his situation. The anger had burned out, leaving only pure, unadulterated panic. "Dad, listen to me," he begged, his voice trembling so violently I could barely understand the words. "You do not understand what you are doing. That ledger is not what you think it is." Mom was sick, and her mind was playing tricks on her. "Those numbers are completely out of context. You cannot give that book to the authorities. They will misunderstand everything. Please just leave the book on the desk. Do not touch anything else. I am booking the next flight back to New York right now. I will be home by tomorrow afternoon, and we can go over the math together. Just do not call anyone else." I sat in the dark, and listened to the absolute terror in his voice. He had finally realized that the physical ledger was the only piece of evidence that could permanently destroy him. The offshore accounts and the shadow loans were entirely digital, but Diane's red ink was a tangible, undeniable confession. He knew that as long as that book existed, his freedom was entirely forfeit. He believed that if he could just get back to the house, he could physically destroy the evidence. He probably planned to rip the pages out and burn them in the backyard fire pit. He thought he could fly home and smooth-talk his way out of a federal prison sentence just like he had smooth-talked his way through his entire adult life. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the mechanism of the trap. He was not coming home. He was never coming home. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale gray light through the window, my phone rang again. It was Arthur Lawson calling from his office. He had been awake all night monitoring the digital footprint of our financial lockdown. He sounded completely wide awake and thoroughly satisfied with the results of our operation. "Howard," he said, his voice crisp and clear over the line. "Your son is currently experiencing the full weight of the federal freeze. The international banking system has completely rejected his existence." Lawson explained the chaotic sequence of events that had unfolded over the last 2 hours. Connor had realized he needed to return to the United States immediately to destroy the ledger. He had left Monica crying in the hotel lobby and sprinted out to the street to find a taxi back to the airport. But he had no cash. He had tried to pay the driver with his corporate credit card, and the driver had thrown him out onto the pavement. Connor had been forced to walk 2 miles to a local train station and beg his way onto a transit car, heading toward the international terminal. Once he finally reached the airport, the real nightmare began for him. Lawson tracked every single desperate attempt through the declined transaction logs. Connor had approached the first-class ticketing counter and demanded a seat on the next direct flight to New York. He handed the agent his primary platinum card. The system instantly flagged it as a fraudulent account and denied the purchase. Connor then pulled out his secondary business card, his personal checking debit card, and a high-limit travel rewards card. Every single piece of plastic was systematically rejected by the airline terminal. The bank had locked him out completely. He is completely trapped. Howard Lawson told me, reading the transaction history aloud. 10 minutes after the airline declined his purchase, he tried to access a cash advance portal using his smartphone. He attempted to transfer $5,000 from his offshore dummy account directly to a digital wallet. The federal investigators had already seized that routing number. The transfer was blocked instantly. 5 minutes later, he tried to apply for an emergency digital loan using his Social Security number. That was also denied because his credit profile is currently under a major federal fraud investigation. He has absolutely no liquidity. He cannot buy a plane ticket. He cannot rent a hotel room. He cannot even buy a cup of coffee at the airport terminal. I listened to Lawson's report and felt a profound, chilling calmness settle over my entire body. The trap had closed perfectly. The noose was pulled tight. Connor was stranded in a foreign country with nothing but the clothes on his back and the terrifying knowledge that his entire life was over. He had spent 5 years treating me like a disposable nuisance. He had believed his wealth made him completely untouchable. Now he was finding out exactly what it felt like to be entirely helpless. "He will try to call his wealthy friends," I told Lawson, staring at the dusty floorboards of my living room. "He will call his country club buddies and beg them to wire him the money for a ticket home." "They will not answer," Lawson replied with absolute certainty. "The federal authorities have already begun executing search warrants at the hardware store and the primary bank branches. Warrants tend to make headlines very quickly in small financial circles. His country club friends will drop him the second they hear the word embezzlement. No one is going to wire international funds to a man who is actively fleeing a federal fraud investigation. They will distance themselves to avoid becoming accessories to his crimes. He is entirely isolated." I thanked Lawson for the update and ended the call. I looked down at Diane's heavy leather ledger still resting on my lap. The sun was fully up now, illuminating the exact spot in the hallway where Connor used to play when he was a boy. The house felt incredibly empty, but it also felt remarkably clean. The infection had been completely excised. My son was stranded thousands of miles away, suffocating under the weight of his own arrogance. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, and I was the one who had finally locked the door. Connor was making a wet, choking sound through the small speaker of my cell phone. He was bargaining now, throwing out desperate numbers and impossible promises with the frantic speed of a cornered animal. He swore he would liquidate his entire financial portfolio the second the markets opened. He promised he would sell the luxury cars, cash out his remaining tech stocks, and wire the entire balance directly into my personal checking account by sunrise. He pleaded with me to just pick up the other line and call Arthur Lawson to reverse the freeze. He told me Monica was sitting on the marble floor of the hotel lobby weeping uncontrollably, and the night manager was threatening to summon the Parisian police to physically remove them from the property. I let him spin his wheels. I let him choke on the toxic fumes of his own collapsing empire. I did not interrupt his frantic rambling right away. I wanted him to exhaust every single avenue of hope before I completely sealed the vault. I sat perfectly still in my dark living room, listening to the sheer terror radiating from a man who had spent the last 5 years believing he was an untouchable genius. "You cannot liquidate a portfolio that no longer exists, Connor," I finally said. My voice was a low, steady rumble in the quiet house. "You cannot sell cars that were purchased with stolen corporate funds. Arthur Lawson did not just put a temporary hold on your checking account. He physically walked into the federal fraud department this afternoon and handed them a certified copy of your mother's ledger. The bank did not just freeze your plastic. They seized your entire financial identity. The corporate accounts, the offshore dummy corporations, the personal wealth management funds, everything has been officially confiscated under federal embezzlement statutes. You do not have a single penny left to your name." I could hear him gasping for air on the other end of the line. It was the sound of a man drowning in a desert. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine that echoed pathetically in my silent room. "You have to call them off. Tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. Tell them I had your verbal permission to allocate those corporate funds. I am your son. You cannot let me go to federal prison. I will do anything you want. I will sign the estate completely back over to you right now." "You do not own the house," I reminded him with absolute surgical precision. "The shadow lender owns the house because you defaulted on the fraudulent mortgage you took out behind my back. You have nothing left to trade. You have absolutely no leverage. And even if I wanted to call the authorities off, which I do not, it is entirely out of my hands now. The fraud department has already escalated the case to the federal authorities. The machine is moving, and you are lying directly on the tracks. There is no way out of this, Connor." I continued, refusing to let him interrupt me. "Do you remember the vintage boat you sold to Gavin Reed yesterday morning? Do you remember the absolute arrogant smirk on your face when you handed him the physical title?" He let out a sharp, pathetic sob. "I did it for the business," he wept, trying one last pathetic time to justify his endless greed. "We needed the capital to stay afloat." "You did it to buy first-class tickets to Paris," I countered, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You did it to buy vintage champagne while you left me 30 days away from being thrown out onto the street. But you made a fatal error. Your mother knew you would try to liquidate her boat. She warned Gavin in writing before she died. When you handed him that forged title yesterday, you handed him the final nail in your own coffin." I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch across the transatlantic connection so he could fully digest the horror of his new reality. "Gavin took the forged title directly to the Port Authority police this afternoon," I told him, letting each word land like a physical blow. "They immediately ran the serial numbers and cross-referenced them with the Federal Registry. The sale was instantly flagged as grand theft and wire fraud. The local police formally handed the jurisdiction over to the federal investigators 2 hours ago. They know exactly what you did. They have the forged documents. They have your mother's handwritten ledger. They have the specific routing numbers for the offshore accounts you used to launder my money." I heard a loud clattering sound through the speaker. It sounded like Connor had dropped his cell phone onto the polished floor of the hotel lobby. There was muffled shouting in French, and Monica's shrill, hysterical voice demanding to know what was happening. I could imagine the scene perfectly. The wealthy American tourists causing a massive scene while the hotel security guards slowly closed in around them. A few seconds later, Connor picked the phone back up. His breathing was so ragged it sounded like he was physically suffocating. "We are going back to the airport." He babbled, his words slurring together in pure, unadulterated panic. "We are going to find a way back to the airport right now. I will sell my gold watch. I will sell Monica's diamond engagement ring to a local pawn shop. We will buy tickets on a cheap budget airline, and we will fly to a country without an extradition treaty. I am not going to a federal prison, Dad. I am not doing it." I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair. The absolute pathetic cowardice of my son was staggering. He was perfectly willing to steal from his dying mother and bankrupt his grieving father, but the second he was forced to face the tangible consequences of his actions, his only instinct was to run away. "You are not flying anywhere, Connor." I stated, my words falling like the heavy steel blade of a guillotine. "You are not getting on another airplane ever again." When the federal investigators compiled the wire fraud charges and the corporate embezzlement evidence, they immediately contacted the State Department. "Your passport was officially flagged and revoked while you were somewhere over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. You are a wanted international fugitive. If you walk into an airport terminal and try to present your passport at a ticketing counter, you will be immediately detained by the armed border police." The truth finally landed. The frantic bargaining completely stopped. The hysterical promises ceased. There was nothing left but the terrifying, crushing reality of his situation. "You are stranded in Paris," I told him, painting the picture of his immediate future with ruthless clarity. "You have no money. You have no credit. You have no valid identification. You cannot book a hotel room. You cannot buy a meal. You are going to be thrown out of that luxury lobby onto the cold street. You and Monica are going to spend the night wandering the foreign sidewalks with your expensive luggage completely destitute. And when you finally get tired of freezing in the dark, your only option will be to walk into the nearest American embassy and surrender." "Dad." He whispered, a weak, broken sound, completely devoid of hope. "When you surrender, they will put you on a military transport." I continued, entirely ignoring his plea. "You will not fly first class. You will fly in handcuffs. And when that plane touches down on American soil, the federal marshals will be waiting for you on the tarmac. You built this prison, Connor. You gathered every single brick. Your mother just locked the door, and I am throwing away the key." I did not wait for his response. I did not want to hear another lie or another pathetic excuse. I reached forward and pressed the button to end the call. The living room was instantly plunged back into complete silence. I sat in the darkness for a long time. My heart was not racing. My hands were not shaking. The overwhelming grief that had been crushing my chest for the past 4 months was completely gone. I looked down at the heavy leather ledger resting on my lap. I placed my hand flat against the cover, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over me. Diane had protected our legacy. She had given me the tools to sever the rot that had infected our family. The parasite was finally gone. Order had been permanently restored. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since my wife passed away, I drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. Exactly 4 days later, the rusted muffler of a battered yellow taxi shattered the quiet afternoon air outside my front window. I did not move from my armchair immediately. I simply sat in the quiet living room and listened to the engine sputter and die in the driveway. The heavy oak front door was securely locked. The deadbolts had been completely replaced the morning after my phone call with Connor. I listened to the heavy car doors slam shut. I heard the rough, grinding sound of cheap plastic luggage wheels dragging across the uneven concrete. I stood up slowly and moved to the edge of the glass window to watch them. The transformation was absolute and staggering. 4 days ago, they had left for the airport looking like royalty. Monica had worn a pristine white silk coat and imported leather boots. Now that same silk coat was severely wrinkled and stained with spilled coffee and city dirt. Her hair hung in greasy tangled strands around her pale, exhausted face. She was not wearing her expensive boots. She was wearing cheap foam sandals she had likely acquired at a transit shelter. Connor looked entirely broken. His designer travel suit was crumpled and smelled of stale sweat even from a distance. He was dragging two massive heavy suitcases behind him because he could no longer afford to pay a porter to carry his bags. His shoulders were slumped forward. He moved with the heavy, dragging steps of a man who had not slept in nearly 100 hours. The arrogant smirk that usually defined his face had been completely erased. It was replaced by a hollow, terrified stare. They had spent the last 4 days trapped in a financial nightmare. I knew exactly what they had endured because Arthur Lawson had monitored the federal reports and kept me updated. Connor had tried to use his invalidated passport to board a train out of Paris. The border authorities had immediately flagged his identification and detained him. He spent 24 hours sitting in a cold concrete holding cell before the local police transferred him to the custody of the American embassy. The federal agents had stripped him of his expensive gold watch and Monica's diamond jewelry to process his emergency repatriation. He and Monica had been forced to stand in line and beg the consular officers for a government loan just to secure 2 seats on a crowded budget airline flight back to the United States. They had crossed the ocean sitting in the back row next to the restrooms eating stale pretzels and drinking warm water. Monica stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs. She dropped her heavy travel bag onto the concrete and covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders began to heave with violent, exhausting sobs. Connor did not even turn around to comfort her. He simply dropped his luggage and marched heavily up the wooden steps. He raised his fist and began to pound violently on the solid oak door. The heavy thud echoed through the silent hallway. Dad opened the door. Connor yelled, his voice hoarse and cracking with desperation. "Dad, I know you are in there. Open the door right now." I did not rush. I walked slowly across the hardwood floor. I let him pound his fists against the wood until his knuckles bruised. I listened to him beg and demand and threaten. His voice was completely stripped of any real power. He was a beggar demanding entry into a castle he had actively tried to burn to the ground. I reached out and turned the heavy brass deadbolt. The lock clicked loudly in the quiet space. I pulled the door open and stood firmly in the threshold. I did not step aside to let him in. I blocked the entrance completely with my body. Connor froze with his fist raised in the air, ready to strike the wood again. His eyes were wide and bloodshot. The smell of cheap airplane cabin air and stale fear radiated off him. He stared at me with his mouth slightly open, trying to formulate a sentence. He looked at my calm, steady posture and realized instantly that his intimidation tactics were entirely useless. "Dad, please let us inside," he begged, dropping his hand to his side. "We have been traveling for 2 straight days. The embassy treated us like common criminals. They made us sign promissory notes just to get on a cargo plane filled with deported tourists. We have not eaten anything but stale crackers since Tuesday. I need to take a shower and I need to sit down. We need to figure out how to fix this massive mistake you made with the bank." I looked past his shoulder at Monica, who was still crying on the driveway. Then I looked back into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. "I am not letting you inside my house, Connor." I stated, my voice perfectly level and cold. "This is no longer your home." His jaw dropped. A flash of desperate anger ignited in his exhausted eyes. "What are you talking about, Dad?" he demanded, stepping closer to the threshold. "I grew up in this house. All my things are upstairs. My entire life is in there. You cannot just lock me out on the street. I have absolutely nowhere else to go." The federal agents seized the keys to my estate yesterday morning. They froze the deed to my property. They changed the security codes on my gates. I do not have a house to return to. "You do not have a house because you bought it with stolen money." "Connor," I replied, entirely unmoved by his pitiful display. "You bought that estate using the corporate funds you embezzled from your dying mother. The federal government is simply repossessing stolen goods. And you are not coming inside my house because you forfeited your place in this family the day you used my property as collateral for a shadow loan. Connor grabbed the doorframe with both hands, trying to force his way past me. Dad, you have to stop this, pleaded, his voice dropping into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. You made your point. You proved you are smarter than me. You won the game. Now please call Arthur Lawson and tell him to drop the charges. Tell the federal investigators that I had your verbal permission to use those funds. If you do not tell them it was a misunderstanding, they are going to arrest me. They told me at the embassy that I have to surrender my passport to a federal judge by Monday morning. I am going to go to federal prison, Dad. I looked at his hands gripping my doorframe. You are going to federal prison because you are a thief and a coward. I told him, stating the immutable facts of his existence. I am not going to lie to a federal judge to save you from the consequences of your own endless greed. You spent 5 years treating me like a pathetic, senile old man. You thought you could bleed this family dry and throw me away the second I ran out of equity. You wanted to play a high-stakes game with my life. I reached forward and firmly removed his hands from the doorframe. He was too weak and exhausted to resist my grip. You lost the game, Connor, I said, stepping back into the hallway. Now get off my property before I call the local police and have you arrested for trespassing. I did not wait for his response. I looked at the pure, absolute devastation on his face, and I pushed the heavy oak door shut. The lock clicked into place with a solid, reassuring sound. I stood in the quiet hallway and listened to him scream my name through the thick wood. His voice was completely broken. He pounded his fists against the door, but the sound was weak and pathetic. The absolute reality of his total ruin had finally arrived. I stood in the quiet hallway and listened to the muffled sounds of their panic bleeding through the heavy oak door. The thumping of Connor's fists eventually slowed and stopped entirely. He was physically exhausted and completely defeated by the solid wood barrier. The silence lasted for only a few seconds before a new sound pierced the quiet afternoon air. It was Monica. Her voice was shrill and vibrating with a hysterical, frantic energy. She marched up the wooden porch steps and began pounding her flat palms against the doorframe. She screamed my name through the thick timber. She demanded that I open the door immediately. Her voice cracked as she resorted to the most pathetic, emotional blackmail imaginable. She yelled that I was a bitter, vindictive old man who was deliberately trying to destroy my own family. She sobbed loudly, claiming that I was ruining her life over a simple financial misunderstanding. She screamed that Diane would be absolutely disgusted and horrified by my cruel behavior. She invoked my dead wife's name while standing on the very porch that Diane had swept and painted for 40 years. The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of her words did not make me angry. It only solidified the absolute necessity of what I was about to do. I realized they still viewed me as a soft, compliant resource they could manipulate with fake tears and loud tantrums. They had absolutely no idea that the man they were trying to bully had already orchestrated their total destruction. I turned away from the door and walked into my home office. I moved to the heavy mahogany desk and picked up 2 thick manila folders that Arthur Lawson had prepared for me earlier that morning. The folders were heavy with the weight of absolute justice. I traced my fingers over the smooth cardboard covers, feeling the tangible evidence of my son's impending ruin. I walked back down the hallway carrying the documents. The shrill sound of Monica's screaming continued unabated outside. She was yelling that they were completely destitute and that their blood was on my hands. She wailed that they had not eaten and had nowhere to sleep. I reached out and unlocked the deadbolt. I pulled the heavy oak door open and stepped out onto the front porch. Monica stumbled backward, her face blotchy and red. Her expensive silk coat was ruined, and her eyes were swollen from 2 days of continuous crying. Connor was sitting on the top step of the porch with his head buried in his hands. He looked up when the door opened. A fleeting, pathetic spark of hope ignited in his exhausted, bloodshot eyes. He thought my resolve had finally broken. He thought I had succumbed to the emotional manipulation and opened the door to offer them sanctuary and a warm meal. I did not invite them inside. I stood firmly on the top of the porch, looking down at them. I held the 2 manila folders in my right hand. The crisp autumn breeze swept across the front yard, rustling the dry leaves on the driveway. Monica opened her mouth to start screaming again, but I raised my left hand and pointed a single rigid finger directly at her face. I told her to close her mouth. I told her that if she spoke one more word or invoked my dead wife's name ever again, I would immediately step back inside and lock the door forever. The lethal, absolute calm in my voice paralyzed her. She snapped her mouth shut and took another step backward, wrapping her arms around her shivering body. I shifted my gaze to my son. He slowly stood up from the wooden step, his knees trembling slightly under his own weight. He looked at the 2 folders in my hand. His eyes darted nervously between the documents, and my face trying to calculate his next move. I told him I was holding his entire future in my hands. I told him he had exactly one opportunity to listen to the terms of his surrender. I raised the first manila folder. I informed him that this folder contained the complete certified police file regarding his financial crimes. I told him it held the high-resolution scans of Diane's handwritten ledger, mapping out every single offshore routing number and fake corporate vendor he had created over the past 5 years. I explained that it also contained the undeniable proof of his wire fraud regarding the vintage boat and the forged signatures he used to secure the shadow mortgage on my property. Connor's face drained of all remaining color. He stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. He knew that the papers inside that thin cardboard cover were enough to put him in a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. I lowered the first folder and raised the second one. I told him this folder contained a different path. I explained that Arthur Lawson had drafted a comprehensive legal confession of extreme corporate embezzlement and systemic financial fraud. I told him the document detailed his exact methods of theft and completely exonerated me from any knowledge of his illegal activities. But a confession was not enough to repair the massive damage he had inflicted on my life. I opened the folder and pulled out a secondary legal document. I told Connor that he was going to sign a binding, irrevocable transfer of deed. He was going to sign over every single ounce of remaining equity in his own massive estate to me. He was going to liquidate his cars, his watches, and his remaining tech stocks and route every single penny into a holding account managed by Arthur Lawson. He was going to use his own personal ruin to completely repay the stolen hardware store funds and instantly clear the fraudulent shadow mortgage he had placed on my home. Connor stared at me in absolute horror. He began to shake his head slowly side to side. He whispered that I could not possibly ask him to do that. He said signing those papers would leave him completely bankrupt and utterly homeless. He claimed I was asking him to sign away his entire life. I looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. I reminded him that he was already bankrupt and homeless. I reminded him that the federal government was already moving to seize his assets. I told him he had exactly 2 choices. He could sign the confession and the equity transfer right now on the hood of his cheap yellow taxi. If he signed the papers and returned my stolen money, I would instruct Arthur Lawson to hand the original ledger over to the local district attorney instead of the federal prosecutors. It would downgrade his inevitable prosecution from a massive federal wire fraud case to a localized state embezzlement charge. It was the difference between spending 20 years in a maximum security federal prison or spending 5 years in a state facility. If he refused to sign, I told him I would walk back inside my house and call the federal marshals directly. I would hand them the original ledger, and I would personally testify against him in a federal courtroom. I would watch the judge sentence him to decades behind bars. Monica let out a loud, horrified gasp. She grabbed Connor's arm and begged him not to sign the papers. She told him they could fight it in court. She told him he was a brilliant businessman and that no jury would convict him if he just explained his side of the story. I did not look at Monica. I kept my eyes locked directly on my son. I saw the absolute crushing reality shatter the last remaining fragments of his arrogance. He knew he was not a brilliant businessman. He knew he was a fraud who had survived entirely on stolen money and his mother's silent endurance. He looked at the folder in my hand, and he knew I was offering him the only microscopic fraction of mercy he would ever receive in his life. I stepped down from the porch and walked over to the rusted hood of the yellow taxi. I placed the confession and the equity transfer documents flat against the cold metal. I pulled a black ink pen from my shirt pocket and dropped it onto the paper. I looked at Connor and told him he had exactly 60 seconds to decide how the rest of his life was going to end. The 60 seconds stretched out in the cold afternoon air like a prolonged execution. I stood on the paved driveway and watched my son stare at the black ink pen resting on the rusted yellow hood of the taxi. His chest was heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. He looked at the legal confession. He looked at the irrevocable transfer of deed. The wind rustled the dead leaves around our feet, but neither of us moved. He was calculating the impossible math of his own survival. He was desperately searching for a hidden loophole or a secret exit that did not exist. He had spent his entire adult life slipping out of traps and buying his way out of consequences. Now he was staring at a solid brick wall. 60 seconds. Connor, I said, my voice flat and entirely devoid of paternal warmth. The clock is ticking down, and the federal marshals are waiting for my phone call. He reached out with a trembling hand and let his fingers hover over the plastic pen. He pulled his hand back as if the plastic had physically burned his skin. He looked up at me with eyes completely filled with panicked tears. The arrogant boy who had commanded boardrooms and belittled his mother was completely gone. He was nothing but an empty vessel of fear. "Dad, you are taking my entire life away," he whispered, his voice breaking into a pathetic, dry sob. "Monica and I will have absolutely nothing. We will be living on the street. I will have no money to start over. You cannot leave your own flesh and blood with nothing. Please let me keep the house. Just let me keep the house and I will sign the confession for the business funds. We can negotiate a payment plan. I will pay you back every single cent over the next 10 years. I will work for you at the hardware store for free. You do not dictate the terms of your surrender," I told him, stepping slightly closer to the car. "You lost the right to negotiate the day you forged my signature to steal the equity from the home I built with your mother. You stole from a dying woman, Connor. You bought a luxury boat while she was sitting in a freezing garage plotting your downfall. You did not offer us a payment plan when you drained our operational reserve. You simply took everything you wanted and expected me to die quietly in the dark. Now you are going to experience exactly what that absolute vulnerability feels like." I looked at my watch. "You have 20 seconds left," I stated. "Sign the documents or I am walking back inside and dialing Arthur Lawson." Connor let out a loud, agonizing groan that echoed down the quiet suburban street. It was the sound of a man watching his empire burn to the ground. He snatched the black pen from the hood of the taxi. His hand was shaking so violently he could barely hold the plastic barrel steady. He pressed the tip of the pen against the thick white paper of the legal confession. He hesitated for one final fraction of a second. Then he dragged the ink across the signature line. His handwriting was an erratic, sloppy mess, but it was legally binding. He flipped to the second document. He signed away the deed to his massive luxury estate. He signed away his cars, his remaining tech stocks, and his entire financial portfolio. He legally bound himself to repay every single stolen dollar to the hardware store and to my personal accounts. He dropped the pen onto the metal hood. It rolled off the side and clattered onto the concrete driveway. He took a staggering step backward, completely drained of all color and energy. "It is done," he whispered, staring at the papers with a vacant, haunted expression. "You took everything." I reached forward and gathered the signed documents. I slid them carefully back into the manila folder. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I felt the clean, sharp air of absolute justice. I told him he was free to leave my property. I told him the localized embezzlement charges would be filed on Monday morning and he would need to find a public defender because he could no longer afford a private attorney. Monica had been standing silently near the trunk of the taxi listening to the entire exchange. She had watched her husband sign away his entire fortune on the hood of a cheap cab. The reality of the situation was finally penetrating her thick shell of entitlement. She slowly walked over to where Connor was standing. Her ruined silk coat fluttered in the autumn wind. She did not reach out to comfort him. She did not offer him a warm embrace or words of encouragement. She looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You signed it," she said, her voice sharp and vicious like broken glass. "You actually signed it all away." "Monica, I had to do it," Connor pleaded, turning to her with a pathetic, desperate expression. "He was going to call the federal marshals. I would have gone to a maximum security prison for 20 years. We can start over. I know a few people who owe me favors. We can find a cheap apartment and figure this out together." She stared at him as if he were a diseased animal. The toxic parasite dynamic that had fueled their marriage for 5 years was instantly shattering right in front of my eyes. Monica had never loved Connor. She had loved the endless stream of stolen money he provided. She had loved the expensive country club memberships and the luxury vacations and the pristine white silk coats. Now the host was completely dead, and the parasite was immediately detaching itself to find a new source of survival. "Start over," she scoffed, letting out a cruel, mocking laugh that echoed down the driveway. "I am not starting over in a cheap apartment with a bankrupt felon. You told me you were a genius, Connor. You told me you had your pathetic father completely under your thumb. You promised me an empire, and now you are begging for a public defender on a dirty driveway. You are completely pathetic, and you are entirely useless to me now." "Monica, please," Connor begged, reaching out to grab her arm. "You are my wife. You promised you would stay with me." She slapped his hand away with incredible force. "Do not ever touch me again," she snarled, her eyes flashing with absolute venom. "I am not your wife anymore. I am not staying with a broke loser who let an old man steal his entire life. I am calling my divorce attorney the second I find a phone charger. You are entirely on your own, Connor." She did not look back at him. She turned around and marched over to her heavy designer suitcase. She grabbed the handle and dragged the cheap plastic wheels across the concrete. She walked right past the idling yellow taxi and began marching down the sidewalk toward the main avenue. She did not look back to see if he was following her. She was abandoning him in the exact moment of his greatest destruction, leaving him to face the ruins of his life alone. Connor stood completely frozen in the driveway. He watched his wife walk away until she disappeared around the corner of the street. His shoulders slumped forward as the final crushing weight of his reality settled over him. He was completely alone. He had no money and no home and no family and no allies. His entire arrogant, untouchable world had been reduced to a pile of cheap luggage and a looming state prison sentence. He had stolen from his dying mother, and he had finally paid the ultimate price. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I turned around and walked away from the yellow taxi. I climbed the wooden steps of my front porch and opened the heavy oak door. I stepped inside my clean, quiet house and closed the door firmly behind me. I turned the heavy brass deadbolt, locking the world out and securing my peace forever. I walked into Arthur Lawson's office precisely at 8 o'clock on Monday morning. The heavy mahogany doors shut behind me, sealing out the chaotic noise of the busy city. Arthur was sitting behind his wide desk with a stack of perfectly organized documents resting on the polished wood. He did not offer me a cup of coffee. He knew we were far past the point of casual pleasantries. He pushed the first document across the desk and pointed to the bottom line. The liquidation of my son's assets was completely finalized. The estate had been sold to a corporate buyer over the weekend. The luxury cars had been surrendered to the dealership. Every remaining stock and mutual fund had been drained and transferred directly into the secure holding account. I stared at the massive numbers printed in stark black ink. The money brought me absolutely no joy. It was simply a heavy, blunt tool required to repair a broken foundation. I told Arthur to execute the first wire transfer immediately. I gave him the exact routing number for the predatory shadow lender who held the fraudulent mortgage on my home. I watched as Arthur typed the sequence into his encrypted terminal and authorized the massive payment. The digital transaction took less than 10 seconds. In that brief window of time, the crushing weight that had suffocated me for months completely evaporated. The house belonged to me again. The walls and the floors and the roof that I had built with my own 2 hands were finally safe. Arthur pushed a second stack of papers across the desk. He informed me that he had delivered Diane's ledger and the signed confession directly to the district attorney earlier that morning. The state prosecutors had officially accepted the deal. The federal authorities had agreed to step back and let the state handle the prosecution, since the stolen corporate funds were being entirely repaid. Connor was going to spend the next 5 years in a state correctional facility. It was a brutal, terrifying future for a man who had only known absolute luxury. But it was a measured mercy. He would lose his freedom, but he would not lose his entire life to a federal penitentiary. I signed my name on the final legal release. I stood up and walked out of the office. The financial war was officially over. My next destination was the municipal marina on the edge of town. I drove my truck through the rusted iron gates and parked near the long row of dry storage bays. Gavin Reed was standing next to his warehouse holding a clipboard. Behind him, sitting on a heavy steel trailer, was Diane's vintage boat. The polished mahogany hull gleamed beautifully under the bright morning sun. Gavin had cooperated fully with the Port Authority police. Once they had verified the forged title and copied the serial numbers, they had released the vessel from the evidence hold. Gavin had every legal right to demand a lengthy court battle to keep the property he had purchased, but he understood the deep emotional gravity of the situation. I walked up to Gavin and reached into my jacket pocket. I handed him a certified bank check drafted from the newly restored corporate accounts. I told him I was buying my wife's legacy back. Gavin looked at the heavy sum printed on the check. He did not try to negotiate or ask for a massive inconvenience fee. He simply folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. He looked at the vintage boat and told me it belonged on the water where Diane had intended it to be. He shook my hand firmly and helped me secure the heavy steel trailer to the hitch on the back of my truck. I drove out of the marina pulling the heavy weight of my past behind me. I felt a profound sense of purpose settling into my bones. Every stolen piece of my life had been meticulously recovered. I woke up the next morning long before the sun even considered cresting the horizon. The world was pitch black and incredibly cold. I walked through the quiet house and gathered a few essential items. I drove my truck down the empty winding highway, heading straight for the deep, secluded lake where Diane and I had spent the greatest summers of our youth. There were no other cars on the road. The towering pine trees on either side of the asphalt looked like massive, silent guardians watching me pass. I reached the deserted public boat ramp exactly at dawn. The air was thick with a dense, freezing fog that rolled slowly across the surface of the black water. I backed the heavy steel trailer down the steep concrete incline. The tires groaned against the wet stone. I stepped out of the truck and unhooked the heavy safety chains. I pushed the vintage boat backward until the polished wooden hull slid perfectly into the freezing lake. The vessel bobbed gently against the current. I climbed aboard and turned the ignition key. The old engine coughed once and then roared to life with a deep, powerful hum that vibrated through the floorboards. It was a familiar, comforting sound that I had not heard in years. I steered the boat away from the concrete ramp and guided it slowly out toward the exact center of the vast open water. The sky began to fracture above the distant tree line. Deep bruises of purple and navy blue slowly gave way to brilliant streaks of vibrant orange and pale gold. The heavy fog started to burn off the surface of the lake, revealing the glassy, untouched water in every direction. I pushed the throttle forward and let the boat cut cleanly through the cold morning air. I drove for 20 minutes until I was completely isolated from the shoreline. There was absolutely no sound out here, except the low hum of the engine and the water splashing against the polished hull. I pulled back the throttle and cut the engine entirely. The sudden silence was absolute and profound. The boat drifted lazily on the calm surface. I walked over to the small storage compartment near the passenger seat. I reached inside and pulled out a bottle of Diane's favorite red wine. It was the exact same vintage we had opened the day we bought this boat 30 years ago. I pulled 2 small glass tumblers from the compartment. I uncorked the bottle and poured the dark crimson liquid into both glasses. The wine smelled rich and earthy in the clean morning air. I picked up the first glass and set it down gently on the polished wooden helm, right next to the steering wheel. I picked up the second glass and held it in my hand. I looked out at the brilliant sunrise reflecting perfectly across the mirror of the lake. The suffocating terror of the past 5 years was entirely gone. The anger and the betrayal had completely washed away. Connor was sitting in a cold cell facing the absolute consequences of his monstrous greed. Monica was scrambling to find a new host to fund her empty, pathetic existence. The hardware store accounts were completely replenished. The house was safe. The boat was back on the water. Diane had sat in a freezing garage while bone cancer slowly destroyed her body, and she had meticulously engineered this exact moment. She had laid the trap with infinite patience and absolute precision. She had trusted me to spring it when the time was right. I raised my glass toward the empty helm. I did not feel the crushing agony of grief anymore. I felt the powerful, radiant warmth of absolute equilibrium. The natural order of my family had been violently and beautifully restored. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine. It tasted like absolute victory. I stood on the deck of my boat surrounded by the golden light of the morning, and I finally let myself breathe. True wealth is built on a foundation of integrity and mutual respect, rather than the exploitation of those who supposedly love us. When individuals treat their family as a disposable resource to fuel their own selfish desires, they inevitably engineer their own absolute destruction. The arrogant belief that a quiet, patient person is weak is a fatal miscalculation, because silence often masks deep observation and meticulous planning. Actions rooted in pure greed will eventually collapse under the weight of reality, leaving the perpetrators isolated and entirely vulnerable to the exact same ruin they callously inflicted upon others. Please share your thoughts in the comments below on how you would handle this ultimate confrontation.